Hello and welcome to my review of Bendy Lone Wolf. Now, I will go out on a limb here and say that I am not really someone who's played a lot of this game series in the past, so to me, much of this is new, and honestly, though I do think it has a couple issues, I do think this is a pretty fun title that fans of the original will enjoy, as well as some other people who kind of enjoy games that aren't so much like they don't take themselves too seriously. But without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, the basis of Bendy Lone Wolf is pretty much can be summed up as this cutscene shows you right here. You are the lone wolf who, more or less, is trying to run away from this giant shadow demon, or ink demon, I should say, that is more or less trying to eat your booty in the worst way possible. Now, in typical Bendy fashion, this game is pretty much entirely a horror game from the beginning to the end. What I find it does well, it does pretty well, but the main issues that start to rise are what I would consider the more elaborate parts of the game itself. But let's start off with just the story and kind of the premise. The premise is you are more or less in this top-down view of these kind of like they feel like pre they feel like they're pre-rendered, but I also feel like there's a little bit of RNG involved where you kind of roam around these hallways and you kind of roam around your base and you're kind of more or less just trying to find supplies every time you take an elevator to one of the locations down below. Now, what makes this complicated and kind of what makes this a horror game more than anything is the fact that these hallways, which besides being procedurally generated, are more than likely always the host of a surge of ink monsters and the ink demon himself that will all be trying to stop you on your journey as you try to get the supplies. Now, I will say from a gameplay perspective, the layout and kind of the world and the story are pretty cool, and this kind of art style and kind of the way the game presents itself is more than anything capable and feels like it's very appropriate for the game itself. Now, like I said before, I've never really played the Bendy series, but I know the Bendy itself series was first person, and I think it kind of threw me off because I thought this would be a first person game. But once I actually loaded in and found out what was going on, I found that the game was actually over the top, which I will admit kind of diminishes the horror aspects for me a bit. Because the whole premise of the Bendy series and the whole premise of the Bendy game is that it's first person and that the ink demon, he more or less will just scare the tar out of you because of the way that the game functions and that you can't see where he's coming from. You might hear him, you might hear the cues, you might even see the cues of the ink blots on the wall, but in this game, you don't really get that. And I really do think it kind of affects it from a horror perspective a little more negatively than I think the developer wanted to. Now, the whole premise is, of course, you're going into each of these areas through the elevator and you're just trying to get supplies while getting chased by the Shadow Demon and the Shadow Homies themselves, or the Ink Homies, I should say. It's so much easier to call them Shadow Homies, is that's kind of what they look like. They look like the Heartless from Kingdom Hearts, but we're not going to talk about that because, hey, that game is totally irrelevant to this conversation. Now, is the story in the world cool enough to justify the kind of basic gameplay premise that we'll talk about in a second? Yeah, I'd say so. The main issues that I run into with this game is that the combat and the kind of just the overall feel of the game really do leave you wanting more. The whole premise is and can be summed up in three words as, or three sentences as, find the supplies, avoid any of the ink dudes, and then make it back to the elevator. That is pretty much it. Now, I will say on the normal difficulty, which is what I always play on because, I'm not trying to get my life ruined over a game series I've never played before. The item variety was pretty decent, but I also read that on easy difficulty, there's way too many items, and then on the hardest difficulty, there's barely any items. So I think there needs to be a little bit of tinkering when we're actually talking about the story itself and how much junk you end up finding in these procedurally generated mazes that you're kind of stuck in until you get everything. Now, it does a really good job, I will say, it kind of being like, it feels like a game that I want to pick up for a couple hours here or there. Kind of is something that maybe I want to play in the background and kind of, maybe not just sit here and do it for 16 hours or 8 hours or however long some of us have played those games for, and like a long sitting. This feels more as like a game that I can sit and play for a couple hours, maybe complete a couple levels, maybe lose a couple times or so on, and just kind of get that experience. And then I'm going to go play something else. And I don't think there's anything wrong with this game being a filler game. But if you look at the Steam page, you can kind of see most of the negative reviews are kind of along the same basis that the game is fun and the story and the world are cool looking and like the over to the top and like going around this studio and kind of investigating things and finding what you need to find is cool. But I do think that the over the top view kind of diminishes the horror aspects a little bit to where I think most people that are expecting that kind of first person, like terrifying ink monster coming out of the corner suddenly and chasing you is more or less gone as well. You can pretty much keep up with him. As soon as you see his little circular ink cloud that follows him, you pretty much know where he's going to be at all times, and he's very easy to kind of keep up with in more sense. There is a cool couple things that I think they added that made this game good. I think there's a fair bit of like kind of roguelike aspects because you can get different weapons, you find different weapon parts, you can kind of build different weapons. Though from a gameplay perspective, each of these weapons doesn't really feel that different. The weapons that I found don't feel any different than the initial plunger, or not the plunger, because you spawn with the frying pan. They don't feel that much different than the frying pan you spawn with. And I think that kind of leads to this kind of feeling of like nothing really changes as you progress besides like almost aesthetically. Like as you travel farther down into the lower depths of the game itself, the maps feel different as far as how they look, but the procedural generation makes it so like you end up with a lot of dead ends, you end up with a lot of like almost traps that feel like they're meant to screw the player. And while I think it kind of adds to the experience and being a game that is meant to be kind of played as like the worst game of cat and mouse you could ever play, I also think that having mazes and having maps that are inherently kind of meant to screw you over, but not on purpose, like it's meant it screws you over just because of the procedural generation. I do think that's kind of a negative that is, worth discussing in the most part. I mean, and the worst part of all is that the gameplay, for what it is, feels relatively simple and it feels like it is appropriate. I mean, you have a block button and you have a hit button. And I know in the original game, which I haven't played, they didn't have a block button and it was more or less like a timing thing. This game feels more like it's more of a skill expression. And I say skill expression very lightly because honestly, most of this game is just how good are you at hiding? How good are you at timing things? How good are you at kind of like remembering what's going on around you? And I think that's why it feels like a really good game of cat and mouse. But on the same note, the lack of weapon variety that feels like actually like different weapons and has different weight to them is kind of disappointing. I do think they nailed the idea that like you're running around and it is a good game of cat and mouse. And I do think the map design feels good sometimes, but the procedural generation kind of throws it off other times. Which, I mean, at the end of the day, we're not going to say that that's a game ruining idea, as I honestly do really think this game is really just a game you're going to play for a couple hours at a time and then maybe go play something else and then you're going to come back and play it a little bit more and honestly I see nothing wrong with that. The game excels at what it's meant to do, kind of the overtop, kind of cat and mouse in a like you're just the rat in a maze and you're getting chased by the cat. The cat does not care what happens to you, it is just trying to get you. I do think the systems in place do need a little bit of tweaking. I do think the weapons would make more sense to actually have them be a little bit different, but I do think from a base game, it feels relatively smooth. And I really didn't have any complaints besides the maps themselves kind of feeling as if they were trying to get me more than the monsters themselves. As well, some of the items are literally locked, for instance, at the end of a giant hallway. And then when the ink demon sees you getting the final item and he comes chasing you down, you really have nowhere to really go besides just kind of try to cheese it and like, oh, I'm going to hide in this longer. So his AI hopefully resets and goes the opposite direction. Or if you got happy feet like I did a couple times when I played this game, you can kind of juke him out of the way. But on the same note, I thoroughly enjoyed the few hours I've spent in it so far. This review, more than anything, feels like one that isn't really cheapening out on what it's doing, but I do think that the game itself is meant to be enjoyed in short bursts. I saw a ton of people in the Steam page that had like 10 to 20 hours that said they beat like the 100% of it in one sitting. And this does not feel the type of game that is going to succeed in that regard. It's fun in a few hour spurts, and honestly, I enjoyed my time with it. And of course, I think the developer did a good job at further keeping up with the universe and kind of the bendy way of doing things. I do think first person would have been a better way to present it as a whole, but on the same note, I think it did or it does well enough in this over the top view to kind of feel like something new while also retaining what made the original so great. That's really what people said. This just feels like an upgraded version of the original game that it's based off of, and it's more or less just a remaster. So I think that people that are fans of that specific lone wolf aspect of the Bendy series, so to say, will be more than happy here. As someone who's new to the series, I enjoyed my time. I do think a couple of the things that I mentioned are not they're not game breakers. But on the same note, I do think, as with most games, this is probably going to be something that things get added to and maybe things get adjusted a little bit. So I am hopeful for the future as far as what it actually ends up being. But that is all I have for today. I would recommend this game to anyone who's friends of the, or not friends, fans of the Bendy series as a whole. And honestly, it's not a bad game to play. I would definitely buy it on sale. It's a cool little thing to play for a couple hours at a time. It feels like a great little time waster and kind of feeds into the idea of like stress and anxiety. And it doesn't really feel like a horror game. If you're looking for a horror game, I wouldn't say this would be the favorite for you. But it does feed into the kind of stress, anxiety aspect of like kind of managing what you're doing and kind of just paying attention to which way you've gone, which way you haven't gone, where's the monster, where's the enemies, and so on and so forth. So as always, I hope y'all enjoyed this review. This one's a little quicker off the top of my head. My next one will be Stiggy and Outer World, so I hope y'all are looking forward to that one. But as always, I hope y'all have a good rest of your day, a good rest of your month, and a good rest of your year, and I will see you on the next video.